Increasing carbon dioxide emissions in our atmosphere are the main driver of global warming. Beyond warming the planet, carbon dioxide also has direct impacts on ecosystems. But we still don't know how carbon dioxide affects single ecosystems or specifically plants. We talked to Professor David Ellsworth from Western Sydney University about the role carbon dioxide plays for plants and for ecosystems. David leads the eucalyptus-free air carbon dioxide enrichment experiment, also known as EucPhase. EucPhase is designed to better understand the effect of rapidly rising carbon dioxide on Australia's native forests.
So plants need a balance of resources. They need sunlight, they need water, they need nutrients, they need carbon dioxide. These are the basic things all plants need. And by needing all of those things, you would think, well, there's probably only just one kind of plant. But of course, plants use these resources differently physiologically. And as a result, they can split the use of those resources. So some plants can use high light, some plants can use low light, some plants can use nutrients at one time of the year, moisture kind of the same way. And as a result, that means that we can have many different kinds of plants that are supported on any given patch of ground, for instance. So carbon dioxide has increased immensely since it's been recorded starting in the late 1950s. And currently we emit about 37 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere. So it's a very large amount of CO2. As a result, CO2 has risen precipitously, particularly in recent years. So in the 1970s, CO2 was rising by about a part per million per year in concentration, and now it's rising by almost 3 parts per million per year. But what does carbon dioxide do for plants? Well, if carbon dioxide is the substrate for photosynthesis, then that means by giving plants more carbon dioxide, they'll photosynthesize more. Typically, that would mean plants would also grow more because plants use that carbon as the building block for their structure. And that means that under elevated CO2, the first prediction that was made was that plants would get bigger. They would grow faster. The problem with that is not all plants benefit the same from high CO2, and not all ecological contexts are the same either. And so what we've subsequently learned from the old idea from the 1980s that plants would just grow more and get bigger is that there are other resources that plants need in a commensurate amount in order to grow more. And so when a plant can gain a certain amount of nutrients and it starts growing more in its above ground part, then it can exhaust those nutrients in the soil, and that can tend to override that CO2 effect, meaning that the plant starts to slow its growth down because it can't thin out those nutrients enough to meet its requirements. So plants have to have those nutrients and water and other resources to also meet their requirements. When they get more CO2, they can grow more, but only if those other resources are also available for the plants. We definitely can't generalize that all plants will grow better in the future. In fact, we know that plants aren't going to grow better in the future in a lot of different kinds of ecological contexts. And here, EucPhase is a great example of that because we're on a low nutrient soil. We're in the driest part of the Sydney Basin. So we have substantial dry periods here. And that means that those plants can't benefit as much from elevated CO2 if those other resources aren't available. In addition, we have different species that use those resources differently. So some plants can really benefit a lot from high CO2 and some plants not. So one of the ideas is actually that in elevated CO2, the world might become weedier. That weedy plants that can really chain the carbon from the atmosphere into high photosynthesis and growth might be the ones that actually benefit the most by rising carbon dioxide. of course, if all of the other resources that they need are available. When you couple warming with elevated CO2, we're talking about a situation that we have theory behind, but we haven't really studied empirically very much. So we know that the same plants that benefit from rising CO2 are probably going to benefit from warming so long as moisture is available for them. So, for instance, in this ecosystem, it might mean that lantana benefits a lot in terms of growth, but only during the wet years. And then what happens during the dry years? Well, we might see dieback from lantana, and we have actually seen that. So it's that's still a bit of an open question, what's going to happen with warming, drying, and wet, and elevated CO2. And that's one reason why we want to do these long-term ecological studies like what we're doing here at UCFACE. We want to really have a long time course where we can observe all of the climate variability, which includes the warming that's occurred over the last decade, and be able to look at the wet and dry events coupled with warming and the high CO2 that we're giving to these plants to see what plants really benefit the most from those conditions. One of our biggest knowledge gaps does have to do with warming and how plants respond to warming. Scientifically, separating that out from moisture is where the difficulty really lies. The second thing that is also a gap in knowledge is how warming and CO2 both combine in terms of how plants respond to them. So those are the two biggest challenges. And in fact, we can do an elevated CO2 experiment at this large scale, but warming is very difficult to implement in a forest at this large scale, whereas CO2 we can implement in this kind of experiment. So experimentally, we're really actually quite limited to natural variation in temperature and things like that. Temperature is a really simple variable and easy to monitor, and yet very complex to study. So my view is that the gap in knowledge really has to do with warming and warming by CO2, which is really the real world scenario that we're staring down in the present day.